Welcome to another episode with Michael Horner. I'm your host, Kirk Durston. And Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Looking forward to
Oh,
this.
that's good.
I've got a little bit of a thing on my ear. Had a biopsy taken on my ear over the
Oh,
last
yeah.
few days. It's
Oh,
probably what do they call it? Basal cell cancer, most likely.
oh,
But the doctor wasn't that worried about it.
okay.
They'll take care of it.
Well, let's hope that the doctor's lack of worry translates to nobody else needs to worry either.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, okay. Today we're going to be looking at Galileo, and we've certainly heard lots of talk about him and Christianity over the last few decades. Keep running into it all the time. But what I'm hearing about him has been evolving. So that what
yeah,
we're hearing regarding the church in Galileo today with new information or more information being put out there, actual facts, it's
yeah,
not quite the same as when the younger days. So, Michael, what have you got to say about Galileo?
yeah. This is a fascinating story, and I've really enjoyed researching it and finding out more about it myself. When the Galileo affair, for lack of a better term, is properly understood without hyperbole, it should be seen as an exception in the relationship between science and Christianity. And that's kind of the context that we're looking at this historical event in, is because it's usually pointed to as evidence of an inherent conflict between religion and science, and usually by religion they mean Christianity here. But in fact, the historical development of science came from Christian thinking. It didn't just pop into existence out of nothing, and it's actually part of a long upward arching curve of what was taking place during the Middle Ages and the influence that Christianity was having on thinking. And we've talked about that a little bit before, but the Galileo affair, uh, as soon as you mention the name, most people are going to think about this negatively. And there's a kernel of truth here still. Like all these blemishes on the Christian record that we're looking at, we, uh, or at least I have come to the conclusion that there is some truth there, and we have to admit wrong that's been done. But we always see exaggeration. We always see mitigating circumstances, and then we have to ask the question: is this what Jesus taught? And were they following the teachings of Jesus, or were these people not following the teachings of Jesus? So we're going to use that same outline as we look at this here. The first point to be made is that when Copernicus, prior to Galileo, first came up with the heliocentric view, the sun being the center of the universe, uh, Copernicus's system actually, his model was really no better. His system was no better than Ptolemy's, the Greek thinker who Aristotle followed, and for predicting astronomic events, it was actually not an improvement upon Ptolemy. In other words, Copernicus's view didn't actually have the science behind it yet, and it didn't change by the time Galileo came along shortly afterwards. And if Galileo's views had been demonstrable, that is, if they could be scientifically supported, things would have turned out very differently. And that's probably the big takeaway here is the science of the time didn't there wasn't enough in support of Galileo at that time to make his case. The data and the scientific consensus were against him and his model, but this became the problem in 1616 when the church, having consulted with the prominent astronomers of the day, they picked a side on this debate and they declared that heliocentrism, the sun centered model, to be heretical. Now, this was a problem. This was a high crime against the kind of free inquiry that drives science, of course. This is a negative side of the church's involvement in science. But for centuries before this event and after this incident, the church was the greatest patron of astronomy. But what they did in 1616 was the wrong kind of involvement.
Okay, let me
So
just jump in here for some clarification, Michael. If I understand what you just said correctly, you're saying that science itself wasn't all on Galileo's side. That it was so it's not just the science. It's not just the church versus Galileo. There's also a science versus Galileo. At least some
it's
scientists.
it's
How
mainly
how mainly is science versus Galileo. Okay, good to
yeah,
clarify that because I never hear that when accusations are raised against the church with regard to Galileo. It's always the church versus Galileo,
right.
and never anything about science versus Galileo. Although what we're seeing here is that it's actually both. But the church drew its opinion. Is this? Do I understand you correctly? The church decided on its opinion after consulting the scientists or the astronomers of the day.
Right, correct.
Okay,
And
so
and,
it's actually
and
science that led the church
yes,
to
right,
think Galileo was wrong.
right.
Okay.
And it's easy for us with hindsight to
Hmm.
see, well, the church backed the wrong horse.
Yeah,
They
for sure.
they missed it. It turned out Galileo was right. Galileo and Copernicus, for the most part, were right, but they didn't actually have the evidence yet to
Hmm.
make the case. So this is not a case of the church backing the scriptures over and against the scientists. They actually backed the majority of scientists against a minority of scientists.
And we see that often. There's I think it was Kitcher who a book we covered in philosophy of science, where science itself will have a ruling paradigm. This is what everybody believes, and then along comes some young person or advanced researcher who says, "Oh, not sure I buy this," and they try and put forward a new theory or a new way of looking at it, which actually might be right. But because it doesn't line up with the ruling paradigm, there's always a period of conflict there. And it's, I'll actually shudder to think how many times science, the ruling paradigm of the day in science, has actually crushed new discoveries simply because they weren't announcing in the right time in the right place. And a lot of the old guard who had invested their careers in the ruling paradigm felt threatened by this and did what they could to keep that old paradigm going.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, because you're exactly right, and that is what's going on here. This is an example of what takes place in science all the time. And as far as the scriptures are concerned, the church had put itself on record as being willing to change their mind if there was incontrovertible evidence. All sides agreed with Augustine, who had taught over 1,000 years before this that biblical interpretation should not and cannot be opposed to assured truths discovered in nature. Yet the church insisted, and most astronomers agreed, that the Copernican view, the Galilean view, was not all that assured. So both Augustine in the 5th century and then Aquinas in the 13th century taught this, that if a proven fact about the world contradicted something apparently said in the Bible, the church should seek a new and more truthful way to read the relevant passage of Scripture. That is, the interpretation of the text should be reconsidered. So this had been a principle that the church had followed for well over 1,000 years. But Galileo's arguments had not yet met that threshold of proof, and so the church has held its ground. And Glenn Scrivener, the author of the book "The Air We Breathe," says Galileo has become a symbol of the brave pioneer standing foursquare behind the science. But he says, but there was no such thing as the science. And at this stage, the evidence and the scientific community were leaning the other way. And there's real irony here. The irony Scrivener says, was that in this famous faith versus science trial, it was the church that was the one demanding the proof. And it was Galileo who was demanding blind assent to a model that was actually wrong. His model was mostly wrong. The idea of heliocentrism was right, but his entire model just didn't work. It was wrong. So it was reasonable for the scientists to say this isn't proven. We're not switching the paradigm yet. But the church, by saying it was heretical, got involved in a way that it shouldn't have. But the second key point is that there were other factors, and there's always mitigating factors, and there were political factors and personal factors that were more significant than the science versus religion issues. You see, Galileo he was ambitious. He wanted to replace Aristotle as the authority, as the go-to guy on the workings of the cosmos. And he had real contempt for Aristotle and real impatience towards any of Aristotle's scholarly admirers. And I mean, I'm summarizing a lot here, but in a somewhat foolish, juvenile move, he publicly insulted his friend, who just happened to be the Pope, in a book, which led to a trial to defend the Pope's personal dignity and his office's authority. So that wasn't a smart move.
No, it doesn't usually work well. But this this somewhat juvenile move you mentioned, I was in my third year of physics, and up to that point, I thought, physics and science in general is all the scientists sit down, they're calm, cool, and collected, and they present their theories, they discuss them, and they all arrive happily at some conclusion. But I remember reading one of the science journals in the science library on the report of a recent physics convention, and the vitriol and the insults and the juvenile behavior that went on between certain scientists with this view versus certain scientists with that view. And I was actually shocked. I was a young person with a very, I suppose, rosy-eyed view of science, and that
Naive,
stays with me to this day. That sometimes a scientist is on the right track, maybe. One of those schools is probably on the right track, but the insults and I was embarrassed and ashamed at what I was reading regarding the reports of just how they were behaving to one another. And unfortunately, that really doesn't help in promoting a particular theory.
Right. Personal issues, people's jobs are at stake, their reputations, their legacy, their whole life's work, maybe, if this new paradigm takes over, right? So you can understand how human nature enters into these types of things. So what actually happened to Galileo as a result of this, his view being declared heretical? Well, in 1633, he was finally convicted of a strong suspicion of heresy, but there was no torture. And that's often part of the story that's told, like he was tortured, tried to get him to recant. No. And he was imprisoned, but it was in a short stay in the home of the Archbishop of Siena. And he was allowed to move home to his own residence that same year to live under house arrest in his own villa in Florence. And he died 10 years later. So there was no torture. There's no wallowing in an isolated medieval type prison. It was quite a different outcome than what most people think. Now, undoubtedly, the church's actions against Galileo were grossly unfair. They were misguided. But the story has just been blown out of proportion, adding fuel to the fire of our outrage at the Inquisition's hateful dogmatism. That's the narrative that we've been taught. But let's just turn the corner a little bit here. And Scrivener makes a very good point. He says to focus on the Galileo affair obscures the rather significant reality, and I think he's meaning more significant reality, that in the 16th and 17th centuries, Christian scientists educated in Christian universities and following a Christian tradition of scientific and mathematical speculation overturned a pagan cosmology, that is the Ptolemaic view, the Aristotelian view, cosmology and physics, and arrived at conclusions that would have been unimaginable within the confines of the ancient Greek scientific traditions. That's the real story of what was going on there. But because of the influence of Enlightenment literary thinkers, not scientists, not the Enlightenment scientists who were almost all Christian theists of one type or another, but the writings of Enlightenment literary thinkers, and then especially later the writings of Draper and White in the mid to late 19th century, the Galileo affair has led to the conflict thesis. The conflict thesis is the label given that scholars use to this idea that religion and science are inherently incompatible. But what's really interesting is that late 20th century scholarship, so not too long ago, has substantially, not 100%, but substantially rejected the conflict thesis, which was ubiquitous 100 years ago in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so the celebrated historian of science, I. Bernard Cohen, notes, quote, the idea that a Copernican revolution in science occurred goes counter to the evidence and is the invention of later historians. End of quote. Just as medieval Christendom gave us human rights, universities, parliaments, and more, it also prepared the way for science. This is Scrivener commenting now. The conflict thesis regarding faith and science does not stack up when you examine the evidence. Modern science was invented nowhere else but among devout Christians in a devoutly Christian age and drawing explicitly on Christian beliefs and practices. And then Scrivener highlights some of the very people we're talking about. Copernicus, quote, to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend the wonderful workings of his laws, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High. End of quote. Galileo, quote, the glory and greatness of Almighty God are marvelously discerned in all his works. End quote. Johann Kepler, quote, geometry is unique and eternal, a reflection of the mind of God. That men are able to participate in it is one of the reasons why man is an image of God. And then finally, Newton. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent, powerful being. These are the scientists that were part of the massive change that took place in scientific methodology and understanding. So Rivka Felde, an associate professor at the Cohen Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Ideas at the Tel Aviv University in Israel, says, quote, 20th century investigations of the trial, and I should stop here, a lot of the archives were made available to us in the late 20th century of this time period. And I mentioned this before with respect to other issues. But this is one of those issues that we got more information about. So 20th century investigations of the trial on the basis of the inquisitorial documents, that's the new documents that were made available, have pointed out the importance of the specific historical and political circumstances in which the trial took place. Studies have been effective in eroding, though not erasing, the belief in an inevitable conflict between science and religion that grew out of the 19th century understanding of the trial of Galileo. And then they add, interestingly, the late 20th century examination of the documents of Galileo's trial not only led historians of science to question the science versus religion interpretation of events, it led the church itself to admit its mistake. 1992, Pope John Paul II publicly acknowledged that the Inquisition was wrong to have judged Galileo the way it did. better late than never. So the conflict story that is usually the conclusion of an appeal to Galileo, um, the Galileo affair, that story turns out to be a myth. When we examine the data, we cannot help but notice that the bigger, more important story is that science emerged in a Christian context for Christian reasons.
Fascinating. It's like as a scientist myself, when people ask or assume that if you're religious, you can't be a scientist, it just makes me smile because
Yeah.
I am a scientist. I am a Christian. I've published papers in science journals of science.
Right.
And it almost seems absurd why people would think that if you are a scientist, you can't be a Christian. But I do point out that modern science is different, is not quite what people think today. There are basically three major categories of science. And the first category, which I call the gold standard, is the experimental method, experimental science. Experimental science is what has given us all the benefits we enjoy today. And that's where you can actually do the experiments, get the results, publish a paper. Somebody else can come along, repeat the experiment, get the same results, and we can move on and invent new things. Other areas of science where there's more of an inductive leap to a conclusion, there's where you can get sometimes people raising their eyebrows. Is that really where we're going to go? Well, we can't test it, but we made an inductive leap. And then there's the third area of science, which has been exposed or called out recently in some of the journals of science, such as Nature. We might call it fantasy science. It's the kind of science, or it's called science, but it's completely non-testable. Multiverse, string theory, Lawrence Krauss's universe from nothing. And their point is that this shouldn't be called science. And it's in that fantasy area of science where you have lots of creative storytelling and so forth, where you do get some conflict between religion but I don't want to call it science, and they're not calling it science. It's kind of like this fantasy end of things where the imagination is allowed to run wild a little bit. And the further we let it run, the more likely it is that we're actually going to get conflict between that and even experimental science down the road. But the gold standard, experimental science, is what most scientists engage in on most universities and research institutions. Probably 95% at least is experimental science, cold hard observations and predictions and repeatability and testability. And I have not found a conflict between God and science in that gold standard of the way science really ought to be practiced.
Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate your input as a scientist yourself for sure. So, the Galileo affair does not justify a conclusion that Christianity is harmful to human flourishing. A mistake was made, uh, but it was in the broader context of Christian teaching um, being the soil in which modern science actually grew and developed.
Mhm.